Mom! Don't marry him!
The happiest day of Margaret Collins' life lasted exactly 23 minutes before everything she believed about love, family, and trust began to fall apart. There she stood beneath the stained glass windows of a small church in Vermont, her hands trembling as she held a bouquet of white roses, her eyes fixed on the man who had taught her how to smile again after 10 years of unbearable loneliness. At 60 years old, Margaret had convinced herself that life had already given her its greatest joys and its deepest sorrows. She had buried her husband, learned how to sleep in an empty house, celebrated birthdays with unanswered silence, and watched her children build lives that no longer needed their mother every single day. Then Ethan Walker appeared when she least expected anyone ever would. He listened without interrupting, remembered the little things she said, and somehow made ordinary afternoons feel meaningful again. Friends called it a miracle. Her neighbors called it a blessing. Margaret simply called it a second chance. But as she prepared to say, "I do," the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church flew open with a force that silenced every whispered conversation. 3 familiar faces rushed inside. Her oldest son, Ryan, looked directly at her, his voice shaking with urgency as he shouted words that no mother ever expected to hear on her wedding day. "Mom, don't marry him." Time itself seemed to stop. Every guest turned toward the entrance. Ethan's calm expression disappeared in an instant. Margaret could barely breathe as the bouquet slipped slightly from her hands. The question hanging over that church would change every life inside it forever. Were her children trying to destroy the only happiness she had found in a decade? Or were they desperately trying to save her from making the biggest mistake of her life? Stories like this rarely begin on a wedding day. They begin years earlier, hidden inside ordinary moments that seem unimportant until everything finally comes together. What happened inside that church wasn't the result of a single argument or one sudden discovery. It was the ending of a journey that had quietly unfolded over months, shaped by grief, hope, suspicion, forgiveness, and the painful reality that love often asks us to trust when every instinct tells us to walk away. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As this remarkable story unfolds, you'll discover that every person inside that church believed they were protecting someone they loved. Margaret believed she was protecting her future. Ryan and his younger sisters believed they were protecting their mother's life. Ethan believed he was protecting a truth he had carried for years. None of them realized that the greatest danger wasn't hidden in a secret waiting to be exposed, but in assumptions that had quietly taken root long before anyone stopped to ask the right questions. Margaret Collins had never imagined she would spend her 60th birthday alone. 38 years earlier, she had married her high school sweetheart, David Collins, a hardworking electrician who believed every problem could be solved with patience, honesty, and a good cup of coffee. Together, they built a modest home, raised 3 children, survived financial hardships, celebrated graduations, welcomed grandchildren, and created the kind of marriage people admired without ever truly understanding the work that held it together. When David suffered a sudden heart attack shortly after retiring, Margaret lost more than her husband. She lost the rhythm of her life. Every room in the house reminded her of conversations that would never happen again. Every holiday became a painful reminder of the chair that remained empty. Her children visited whenever they could, but careers, marriages, and raising families of their own slowly filled their calendars. They loved their mother deeply, yet love expressed through occasional visits could never replace daily companionship. Margaret never blamed them. She smiled during every phone call, insisted she was doing just fine, and quietly carried the loneliness that so many widows know but rarely describe aloud. She believed that chapter of love had ended forever. She simply didn't know that another chapter was already waiting to begin. The happiest day of Margaret Collins' life lasted exactly 23 minutes before everything she believed about love, family, and trust began to fall apart. On a crisp October morning in the quiet New England town of Stowe, Vermont, the 60-year-old widow stood beneath the stained-glass windows of St. Michael's Church, wearing an elegant ivory dress she had almost convinced herself she was too old to wear. Soft music drifted through the sanctuary as family friends smiled with genuine excitement, many of them wiping away tears because they understood exactly what this moment meant. 10 years earlier, Margaret had buried the only man she had ever imagined growing old beside. She had spent a decade believing that chapter of her life had closed forever. Yet there she was, bouquet trembling gently in her hands, looking toward Ethan Walker, the man who had somehow convinced her that life could still surprise her after unimaginable loss. Every guest believed they were witnessing something beautiful. No one had the slightest idea they were about to witness something unforgettable. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened inside that church would become the kind of story people whispered about for years, not because of the wedding itself, but because of the painful truth that surfaced before the vows were ever spoken. Margaret had spent the previous night awake, not because she was nervous about marrying Ethan, but because happiness itself had begun to feel unfamiliar. She had walked quietly through her home one last time before leaving as an unmarried woman, pausing in the kitchen where she had once prepared breakfast every morning for her late husband, David Collins. His favorite coffee mug still rested inside the cabinet, untouched for years. His old workshop remained exactly as he had left it, every tool hanging neatly in its place because Margaret had never found the strength to change anything. Countless people had encouraged her to move on after David's passing, insisting he would have wanted her to find joy again. She appreciated their kindness, yet those words never made the silence inside the house any easier to bear. For years, she convinced herself that loneliness was simply the price people paid for experiencing true love. She accepted it without complaint, believing that some stories only deserved one great romance. Then Ethan entered her life with quiet patience instead of grand promises, and for the first time in years, she caught herself laughing without feeling guilty afterward. The church filled steadily as familiar faces greeted one another with warm embraces. Neighbors who had watched Margaret raise her children smiled proudly as they found their seats. Members of her church spoke softly about how wonderful it was to see her happy again after everything she had endured. Even those who barely knew Ethan admitted he seemed thoughtful, respectful, and deeply devoted to Margaret. He wasn't flashy or wealthy. He never tried to impress people with expensive gifts or dramatic speeches. Instead, he possessed the kind of calm confidence that made others feel comfortable around him. During the year they had dated, he had volunteered at local food drives, helped elderly neighbors with home repairs, and quietly earned the respect of nearly everyone who met him. Margaret often said that Ethan never tried to replace David because he understood no one ever could. He simply wanted to build something new alongside the memories she already carried. Those words reassured everyone except the three people whose opinions mattered most: her children. Ryan Collins, Margaret's oldest son, had barely spoken during the rehearsal dinner the evening before. At 40 years old, Ryan had inherited his father's protective nature, but unlike David, he often allowed worry to speak louder than trust. His younger sister, Emily, noticed his silence immediately, exchanging concerned glances with their youngest sibling, Sarah, who had tried repeatedly to convince herself that Ryan was simply struggling emotionally with seeing their mother remarry. After all, many adult children find themselves caught between wanting their widowed parent to be happy and fearing that someone new might somehow erase the memory of the parent they lost. Margaret believed that was exactly what her children were experiencing. She never imagined there could be another explanation. Whenever Ryan asked questions about Ethan's past, she gently reminded him that everyone deserved privacy. Whenever Emily expressed uncertainty about certain details Ethan had shared, Margaret smiled and explained that people often remembered old events differently. She interpreted every concern as grief, wearing a different face. Unfortunately, Ryan wasn't acting out of grief alone. As guests settled into their seats, Margaret waited in a small room beside the sanctuary with her lifelong friend, Carol Benson, who carefully adjusted the delicate veil resting across Margaret's silver-blonde hair. Carol had watched Margaret survive the darkest years following David's passing. She had seen the empty evenings, the unanswered phone calls, the birthdays celebrated with quiet tears instead of laughter. More importantly, she had witnessed the remarkable transformation that occurred after Ethan entered Margaret's life. Color gradually returned to her wardrobe. Fresh flowers appeared inside the house again. Music played softly during dinner instead of television filling the silence. Margaret began traveling to nearby towns on weekend afternoons simply because Ethan enjoyed exploring antique bookstores and roadside cafes. The woman who had once counted hours until bedtime now looked forward to tomorrow. Carol squeezed Margaret's hand and whispered that David would be proud of her courage. Margaret smiled through misty eyes, believing with every part of her heart that today marked the beginning of the happiest chapter she had left to live. Then everything changed. The church doors burst open with such force that every conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned toward the entrance as three figures hurried down the center aisle. Their expressions filled not with celebration, but with unmistakable urgency. Ryan led the way, followed closely by Emily and Sarah. None of them looked angry. They looked terrified. Before anyone could ask what had happened, Ryan's voice echoed through the sanctuary with a desperation that froze every person where they stood. "Mom, don't marry him." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Margaret stared at her son, unable to process what she had just heard. Ethan remained motionless near the altar, his face losing its calm composure for the very first time. Guests exchanged confused whispers while the pastor quietly lowered the wedding book resting in his hands. Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she barely noticed the bouquet slipping toward the floor. She looked from Ryan to Ethan, searching desperately for an explanation that made sense. Instead, Ryan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, removed a thick envelope filled with documents, and said 6 words that would shatter everything she thought she knew. The silence inside St. Michael's Church became almost unbearable after Ryan's shocking words echoed through the sanctuary. Margaret stared at the thick envelope in her son's trembling hands before slowly turning toward Ethan Walker, searching his face for the reassurance she had always found there. Instead, she saw something she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was resignation, as though he had spent months expecting this exact moment to arrive. The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances while whispers spread from one pew to another. Emily held Sarah's arm tightly, fighting back tears as if she wished none of this had ever become necessary. Margaret felt her heartbeat racing faster with every passing second. The happiest morning of her life had transformed into a courtroom without warning, and somehow she had become both the judge and the person standing trial. The question that consumed every mind inside the church wasn't whether Ryan believed he had discovered something important. It was whether that discovery was actually true, or whether fear had convinced him to mistake coincidence for evidence. To understand how everything reached this heartbreaking moment, we have to leave the church behind and return almost 18 months earlier, long before wedding invitations were mailed, before engagement rings were exchanged, and before Ryan ever questioned Ethan's past. At that time, Margaret Collins had become a woman who measured her days by routine rather than purpose. Every morning began the same way. She watered the flowers David had planted years earlier, prepared breakfast for one, folded yesterday's newspaper, and spent long afternoons reading novels she often couldn't remember because loneliness made concentration difficult. Friends invited her to dinners and church gatherings, but she politely declined more often than she accepted. She appreciated their kindness, yet she always found herself returning home, feeling even more aware of the silence waiting inside. Retirement had brought freedom that many people dream about, but freedom meant little when there was no one left to share ordinary moments. Margaret never complained because she believed everyone carried burdens invisible to others. Still, every evening she quietly asked herself the same question. Was this all the rest of her life was ever going to be? Everything changed one rainy Thursday afternoon inside a small independent bookstore just outside Burlington. Margaret had stopped there while waiting for the weather to clear, wandering slowly through the history section before reaching for a novel resting on the highest shelf. Before she could stretch far enough, another hand gently removed the book and offered it to her with an easy smile. The man introduced himself as Ethan Walker, a retired architect who had recently moved to Vermont after spending decades working across several northeastern states. Their conversation lasted barely 15 minutes, touching on favorite authors, old movies, and the simple pleasure of reading on rainy afternoons. When Margaret finally left the bookstore, she assumed she would never see him again. Life often brings brief conversations with strangers that disappear as quickly as they begin. Yet destiny has a remarkable habit of arranging second meetings when people least expect them. 3 days later, they crossed paths again during a charity breakfast organized by Margaret's church, and Ethan greeted her as though they were old friends reunited after years apart. Their friendship developed naturally, without pressure or expectation. Ethan never asked Margaret to forget David. Instead, he encouraged her to talk about him whenever she wanted. He listened patiently as she shared stories about raising 3 children, family camping trips, Christmas traditions, and the quiet strength David had shown throughout their marriage. Many widows later admit that one of the hardest parts of losing a spouse is watching people avoid mentioning the person they loved, almost as though speaking their name might reopen old wounds. Ethan understood the opposite was true. Memories kept love alive. He asked thoughtful questions about David's hobbies, admired photographs displayed throughout the house, and even laughed at stories of David's terrible singing voice during long road trips. Margaret found herself appreciating something she hadn't realized she missed. Someone was genuinely interested in understanding the life she had lived instead of trying to replace it. Without realizing it, she began looking forward to Ethan's phone calls, their walks through quiet parks, and afternoons spent discovering little cafes hidden across northern Vermont. Months passed before Ethan ever suggested they consider themselves more than friends. By then, Margaret had already noticed subtle changes in herself that felt almost unbelievable. She smiled more often. She accepted invitations she once declined. She started baking again simply because Ethan loved homemade apple pie. Friends at church commented on the warmth returning to her eyes. Even her grandchildren noticed that Grandma laughed more during family visits. Margaret resisted the idea of romance at first, convinced that falling in love after 60 somehow betrayed the memory of the husband she had cherished for nearly 4 decades. Ethan never argued with her fears. He simply reminded her that loving someone new could never erase the love that came before. The heart, he said one evening while watching the sunset over Lake Champlain, was never designed to hold only one season of happiness. Those words stayed with Margaret long after she returned home. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by what she had lost. Her children reacted differently when she finally introduced Ethan to the family. Emily appreciated his kindness almost immediately, especially after watching him patiently assemble a toy train with her young son during Thanksgiving dinner. Sarah admired the respect he consistently showed their mother, noticing that he never interrupted her, never dismissed her opinions, and always treated her with quiet dignity. Ryan, however, remained cautious from the very beginning. He wasn't openly hostile, nor did he accuse Ethan of any wrongdoing. Instead, he asked questions that most families would consider perfectly reasonable. Where exactly had Ethan lived before moving to Vermont? Did he have children of his own? Why had no one from his previous community ever visited? Margaret answered what she could, while Ethan politely explained that much of his family had either passed away or settled in distant states over the years. The explanations seemed believable enough to everyone else. Ryan nodded respectfully each time, but something deep inside him refused to settle. It wasn't a single answer that troubled him. It was the feeling that several small pieces simply didn't fit together. That feeling grew stronger over the following months. During Christmas dinner, Ethan mentioned attending college in Massachusetts. Weeks later, while telling another story, he casually referred to beginning his career in Connecticut immediately after high school. At first, Ryan assumed he had simply misspoken, but then other details began shifting in similar ways. Dates changed slightly. Cities seemed to move. Certain memories appeared unusually vague whenever someone asked follow-up questions. None of it proved dishonesty. Human memory is imperfect, especially when recalling events decades in the past. Yet Ryan couldn't ignore the growing pattern. One evening, he mentioned his concerns to Emily, expecting her to dismiss them completely. Instead, she admitted she had noticed a few inconsistencies herself, although she believed there was probably an innocent explanation. Sarah urged both of them to let the matter go, reminding them that their mother deserved happiness after everything she had endured. Ryan wanted to believe she was right. He truly did. But as he watched Margaret become more deeply committed to Ethan, another thought refused to leave his mind. What if asking difficult questions today prevented unimaginable heartbreak tomorrow? That single question became the beginning of an investigation that none of them ever expected to start, and one that would eventually lead Ryan to uncover a name, an address, and a photograph that changed everything he thought he knew about Ethan Walker. Ryan Collins never imagined he would spend his evenings investigating the man his own mother intended to marry. It wasn't how he had been raised. His father, David Collins, had always taught him to judge people by their character rather than rumors, to ask questions before reaching conclusions, and to never accuse someone without evidence. Those lessons had shaped Ryan throughout his life, which was precisely why he resisted his growing suspicions for weeks. More than once, he told himself he was simply being overprotective. Perhaps seeing another man occupy the place where his father once stood was affecting his judgment in ways he couldn't recognize. He wanted to believe that was the answer. He wanted to convince himself that Ethan Walker was exactly who he claimed to be, a kind widower who had entered Margaret's life at exactly the right moment. Yet every time Ryan decided to let the matter rest, another small inconsistency appeared. None of them were alarming on their own, but together they formed a puzzle that refused to fit. Ryan wasn't searching for a scandal. He was searching for peace of mind, hoping every question would eventually lead to an ordinary explanation. Instead, every answer seemed to produce two more questions. The investigation began quietly, almost accidentally. One evening after work, Ryan searched public property records to learn where Ethan had lived before moving to Vermont. There was nothing unusual about the request. Property ownership in many parts of the United States is part of the public record, and Ryan expected to find a straightforward history that matched Ethan's stories. At first, everything appeared normal. Ethan had indeed purchased the small house where he currently lived shortly after arriving in Vermont. Before that, however, the trail became unexpectedly difficult to follow. Addresses appeared briefly before disappearing again. Some records listed slightly different versions of his name. Others ended abruptly without any obvious explanation. Ryan assumed it was probably the result of old paperwork, database errors, or changes that naturally occur over decades. Still, something about the scattered information unsettled him. He printed several pages, highlighted dates, and placed them inside a folder with every intention of forgetting about it. Instead, that folder slowly grew thicker as the weeks passed. A few days later, Ryan contacted an old college friend named Michael Harper, who worked as an investigative journalist for a regional newspaper in New Hampshire. Michael had spent years researching public records, interviewing witnesses, and uncovering forgotten stories hidden inside ordinary documents. Ryan trusted him not because he expected him to expose wrongdoing, but because Michael understood how easily innocent facts could be misunderstood. Over coffee, Ryan explained everything, carefully avoiding dramatic accusations. He admitted he hoped Michael would laugh, tell him he was worrying over nothing, and encourage him to enjoy his mother's wedding. Michael listened patiently without interrupting. When Ryan finished, he leaned back in his chair and offered advice that seemed simple enough. "Never look for proof that someone is guilty," he said. "Look for proof that they're telling the truth. If the truth is there, it'll eventually find you." Ryan appreciated the wisdom. Unfortunately, neither of them realized where that search would eventually lead. Meanwhile, Margaret continued building a future she had never expected to have. She and Ethan spent weekends exploring scenic back roads throughout Vermont, visiting farmers markets, attending local concerts, and volunteering together at community events. Ethan fit naturally into the rhythm of her life. He remembered birthdays without reminders, fixed small problems around the house before she even noticed them, and treated every member of her family with steady respect despite sensing Ryan's growing distance. Margaret often caught herself wondering why happiness had taken so long to return, only to remind herself that perhaps some blessings arrived precisely when people were finally ready to appreciate them. For the first time in years, she found herself imagining retirement not as the closing chapter of her life, but as the beginning of another adventure. Friends commented that she looked 10 years younger. Even her family doctor remarked that her blood pressure had improved remarkably since meeting Ethan. Every visible sign suggested she had found exactly what she deserved after years of loneliness. Ryan wanted nothing more than to believe the same thing. Then Michael called. His voice sounded unusually serious as he asked Ryan if they could meet in person instead of discussing the matter over the phone. They met the following afternoon at the same quiet coffee shop where their earlier conversation had taken place. Michael placed a thin folder on the table between them, but didn't open it immediately. He explained that most of Ethan's background matched what he had shared with Margaret. There was evidence of his career in architecture, records confirming his move to Vermont, and documents showing no history of financial fraud or violent crime. Ryan felt immediate relief, convinced the investigation had reached its conclusion. Then Michael slid one photograph across the table. It showed Ethan standing beside another man outside a courthouse nearly 20 years earlier. The image itself wasn't shocking. What caught Ryan's attention was the newspaper caption beneath it. Ethan wasn't identified as Ethan Walker. He was identified by another name entirely. Ryan stared silently at the photograph, assuming there had to be some kind of mistake. Michael wished he could say the same. "I checked it 3 times," he said quietly. "The face is unquestionably his." Ryan's first instinct was to confront Ethan immediately, but Michael urged patience. A name change, he explained, was not evidence of criminal behavior. People legally change their names for many reasons: marriage, adoption, family conflict, witness protection in extremely rare cases, personal safety, or simply wanting a fresh start after painful experiences. Jumping to conclusions without understanding the circumstances could destroy an innocent man's reputation forever. Ryan knew he was right. Yet one question continued echoing inside his mind. If Ethan had changed his name for an honest reason, why had he never told Margaret? Their wedding was only 6 weeks away. Surely a secret that's significant should have been shared long before now. Ryan left the meeting carrying the photograph inside his jacket pocket, unsure whether he had uncovered something deeply important or simply wandered into a misunderstanding that would eventually embarrass everyone involved. That evening, Emily and Sarah joined Ryan at his house after he insisted they needed to talk. He carefully explained everything Michael had discovered, emphasizing that none of it proved Ethan had done anything illegal. Emily studied the newspaper photograph in stunned silence before asking the question Ryan had been asking himself all afternoon. Why would someone hide their real name from the woman they want to marry? Sarah immediately defended Ethan, suggesting there could be deeply personal reasons connected to family tragedy or painful memories. Ryan agreed completely. In fact, that possibility worried him even more. Whatever the truth was, Margaret deserved to hear it from Ethan before standing at the altar. The three siblings made a difficult decision together. They would speak privately with Ethan and give him every opportunity to explain. If his explanation made sense, they would support the wedding without hesitation. None of them wanted conflict. None of them wanted drama. They simply wanted honesty. But before they could arrange that conversation, another discovery appeared, one that transformed a simple question about an old name into something far more difficult to ignore. Hidden inside decades-old newspaper archives was a forgotten article connected to the very same courthouse photograph. And according to that article, the man now known as Ethan Walker had once disappeared from an entire community without saying goodbye to anyone. Ryan barely slept after reading the newspaper article. He must have gone through it a dozen times before sunrise, hoping that with each reading he would discover something he had missed, some sentence that would explain everything and allow him to close the folder forever. Instead, the opposite happened. The more carefully he studied the faded print, the more questions emerged. The article had been published nearly 20 years earlier by a small local newspaper in western Massachusetts, reporting on the unexpected disappearance of a respected architect identified as Nathan Brooks, the same face now known to Margaret as Ethan Walker. According to the report, Nathan had resigned from his firm without warning, sold his home within weeks, and left the community so quietly that even close neighbors claimed they had no idea where he had gone. There was no mention of criminal charges, no allegations of fraud, no accusations of violence, and no indication that law enforcement considered him a suspect in any investigation. Yet one sentence lingered in Ryan's mind long after he finished reading. It stated that several people who knew Nathan described his departure as completely out of character, leaving behind friendships and a career that had taken decades to build. Why would a man abandon an entire life unless something had happened that he simply couldn't leave behind? Michael Harper agreed to continue helping, but he insisted they proceed with caution. As a journalist, he had seen too many lives damaged by assumptions that later proved completely false. Facts tell stories, he reminded Ryan. People often tell themselves stories before they have all the facts. Together, they began contacting individuals whose names appeared in old public records connected to Nathan Brooks. Many phone numbers were disconnected. Some former neighbors had moved away years earlier. Others had passed on. A handful of people remembered Nathan only vaguely, describing him as polite, hardworking, and private. No one spoke of him with bitterness or fear. If anything, they sounded confused by his sudden disappearance. One retired contractor recalled working alongside Nathan on several community projects and insisted he had been one of the most dependable men he'd ever met. Another former colleague described him as someone who always volunteered to mentor younger employees. Nothing they uncovered resembled the profile of a dangerous man. Yet the unanswered question remained. If Nathan Brooks had been respected by everyone around him, why had he erased his own identity and begun calling himself Ethan Walker without ever telling the woman he intended to marry? While Ryan searched for answers, Margaret continued planning the wedding she had dreamed about for months. Invitations had been mailed. The church had been decorated. Her grandchildren were practicing their roles in the ceremony, and friends from neighboring towns called daily to ask whether she needed help with last-minute preparations. Ethan remained the calm center of everything. He met with the pastor, finalized the reception plans, and even spent an afternoon repairing a loose step on Margaret's front porch after noticing it had become slightly unstable. Watching him work reminded Margaret of David, not because Ethan resembled her late husband. They were very different men, but because both believed love revealed itself through small acts of service rather than grand declarations. More than once, she caught herself thanking God for bringing someone in her life who understood that grief never truly disappears. It simply learns to make room for hope. Margaret had no idea that only a few miles away, her children were struggling with a decision that threatened to destroy the happiness she had fought so hard to find. Emily found herself caught between loyalty to her mother and trust in her brother. Unlike Ryan, she had always believed people deserved the chance to explain themselves before being judged. Every interaction she had shared with Ethan pointed toward kindness and sincerity. He remembered the names of her children, attended school concerts without being asked, and even drove across town one snowy evening to help her husband jumpstart a dead car battery. Those weren't the actions of someone pretending to care. They were the actions of a man who seemed genuinely invested in becoming part of their family. Yet Emily couldn't ignore the evidence sitting inside Ryan's growing folder. The name change was real. The newspaper article was real. The missing years in Ethan's past were real. She asked herself the same question repeatedly. If Ethan had a completely innocent explanation, why hadn't he shared it with Margaret from the very beginning? Secrets have a way of growing heavier with time, especially when they involve the people we love most. A breakthrough came unexpectedly when Michael tracked down an elderly woman named Eleanor Simmons, who had worked as an administrative assistant at the architecture firm where Nathan Brooks had once been employed. At 81 years old, Eleanor's memory remained remarkably sharp. She remembered Nathan immediately, not because of his professional achievements, but because of the day he disappeared. He wasn't running away, she said quietly during their phone conversation. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. She recalled seeing him pack a small cardboard box containing family photographs, a framed certificate, and a worn leather Bible that had always rested on his desk. Before leaving, Nathan thanked every employee individually, shook hands with the firm's owner, and walked out without explaining where he was going. Eleanor insisted there had been tears in his eyes. Whatever happened, she told Michael, it broke him. When Ryan heard those words, he felt something unexpected, sympathy. For the first time since beginning the investigation, he considered the possibility that Ethan wasn't hiding from justice. Perhaps he was hiding from pain. Even so, one final discovery convinced Ryan that he could no longer remain silent. Michael obtained a copy of a civil court filing connected to Nathan Brooks from the same year he disappeared. The case had nothing to do with financial crimes or personal misconduct. Instead, it involved a bitter legal dispute that ended almost as quickly as it began, with most of the records sealed from public view. Only a few pages remained accessible, and they revealed frustratingly little. Yet one detail stood out. Nathan Brooks had filed the case himself, and only weeks later, he voluntarily withdrew it before vanishing from the community. Why would someone begin fighting so fiercely for something important, only to abandon the case entirely and disappear? The sealed records offered no answers, but they convinced Ryan that Ethan's past contained far more than a simple name change. He no longer believed waiting until after the wedding was an option. 3 days before the ceremony, Ryan called Ethan and asked if they could meet privately. To his surprise, Ethan agreed without hesitation. They chose a quiet lakeside park where the autumn leaves floated gently across the water. Ryan carried the folder beneath his arm, rehearsing 100 different ways to begin the conversation without sounding accusatory. As Ethan approached, he greeted Ryan with the same warm smile he always had, though something in his expression suggested he already knew why this meeting had been arranged. They sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the lake, neither man speaking for several long moments. Finally, Ryan removed the faded newspaper photograph from the folder and placed it between them. Ethan looked down at the image, closed his eyes briefly, and released a slow, weary breath. When he opened them again, there was no attempt to deny what Ryan had discovered. Instead, he quietly said 7 words that made Ryan's heart sink. "I've been praying this day would come." Ryan stared at Ethan Walker in stunned silence, unable to understand why a man who had spent months avoiding questions about his past would now admit, without hesitation, that he had been expecting this confrontation. There was no panic in Ethan's voice, no attempt to grab the folder or dismiss the evidence as a misunderstanding. Instead, he looked out across the calm water, as though he had rehearsed this conversation countless times in his own mind. Ryan had prepared himself for excuses, denials, even anger. He had not prepared himself for acceptance. For several moments, neither man spoke. The only sound came from the gentle wind moving through the trees surrounding the lake. Finally, Ethan reached for the faded newspaper clipping and held it carefully between his fingers. "Yes," he said quietly, "the man in that photograph is me. My name wasn't always Ethan Walker. Years ago, I was Nathan Brooks. And everything you've uncovered is true. What you haven't uncovered is the reason." Ryan felt every emotion inside him collide at once. Relief that Ethan wasn't pretending. Frustration that he had hidden something so significant. Curiosity about what kind of past could persuade a man to abandon his own name. Most of all, Ryan wanted one simple answer. "Why didn't you tell my mother?" Ethan lowered his head before answering with words Ryan would never forget. "Because I was afraid that if she knew who I used to be before she truly knew the man I've become, she would never have given me the chance to love her." Ethan began telling a story that Ryan had never imagined hearing. More than 20 years earlier, Nathan Brooks had been living what most people would describe as a successful life. He had built a respected architectural career, owned a comfortable home, and shared his life with his wife, Rebecca, and their only son, Daniel. By every outward measure, they appeared to be an ordinary American family. But one icy December evening changed everything. Rebecca and Daniel were driving home from visiting relatives when another vehicle crossed the center line during a snowstorm. The collision claimed both of their lives before Nathan could even reach the hospital. In a single night, every dream he had built disappeared. Friends surrounded him with support at first, but grief has a strange way of isolating even the people who are deeply loved. Weeks became months. Months became years. Nathan stopped recognizing the man staring back at him in the mirror. He poured himself into work because work demanded nothing emotionally. Yet every blueprint reminded him of the home he would never share with his family again. Every holiday became another reminder of the empty chairs waiting around the table. Ryan listened without interruption, recognizing a familiar pain. His own mother had walked through the valley of grief after losing David. The difference was that Margaret had children who helped keep her moving forward. Nathan had been left completely alone. The legal case Ryan had discovered had nothing to do with dishonesty or financial misconduct. It involved a lawsuit against the trucking company responsible for the accident that killed Rebecca and Daniel. Nathan fought for accountability with every ounce of strength he had left, believing that justice might somehow ease his suffering. Instead, the lengthy legal battle forced him to relive the worst day of his life again and again. Depositions, insurance disputes, courtroom hearings, and endless delays slowly consumed him. By the time the case finally reached a settlement, Nathan realized no amount of money or legal victory could restore what he had lost. He withdrew from the community because every street, every restaurant, every familiar landmark carried memories too painful to bear. He sold his house, donated most of his possessions, and moved away with no intention of ever building another life. "I wasn't running from the law," Ethan said softly. "I was running from memories that followed me everywhere." Ryan looked down at the folder in his lap, realizing how differently the documents appeared now that someone had finally filled in the missing pieces. Every record he had uncovered had been accurate. What had been missing was the human story hidden between the lines. Years passed before Nathan even considered introducing himself as Ethan Walker. The decision wasn't made overnight, nor was it an attempt to erase the past. A grief counselor once told him that every morning he woke up expecting Nathan Brooks to continue living a life that no longer existed. The counselor suggested something unusual. She encouraged him to choose a name connected not to the tragedy he had endured, but to the future he still had permission to build. After months of reflection, Nathan legally changed his name to Ethan Walker. Ethan because it reminded him of endurance, and Walker because he wanted to remember that healing was never a destination, but a journey taken one step at a time. He kept photographs of Rebecca and Daniel in a private box that he visited every anniversary. He never stopped loving them. He simply reached a point where surviving no longer felt like enough. He wanted to live again. Ryan listened carefully, yet one question remained. If everything you've told me is true, why hide it from my mother? Ethan's eyes filled with emotion before he answered. Because by the time I realized I should have told her everything, I had already fallen in love with her. And every day afterward, the conversation became harder to begin. Ryan left the lakeside meeting carrying far more than a folder of documents. He carried the burden of deciding what to do with the truth. Ethan had not lied about being kind. He had not lied about loving Margaret. Yet he had withheld the most important chapter of his life from the woman he intended to marry. Emily believed Margaret deserved complete honesty before taking her vows. Sarah argued that Ethan's explanation deserved compassion, especially considering the unimaginable loss he had endured. Ryan found himself standing between both perspectives. He no longer believed Ethan posed any danger to their mother. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that trust cannot flourish where important truths remain hidden. The siblings argued late into the night, each convinced they were acting out of love. Finally, Ryan made a painful decision. If Ethan couldn't bring himself to tell Margaret before the ceremony, then they would have no choice but to stop the wedding themselves. Not to humiliate him, not to punish him, but to ensure their mother entered marriage knowing the complete truth. They prayed it would never come to that. Unfortunately, time ran out before Ethan found the courage to speak. That is how they found themselves standing inside St. Michael's Church on what should have been the happiest morning of Margaret's life. Ryan remembered every heartbeat as he walked through the doors, carrying the envelope that now felt impossibly heavy. He saw confusion spread across the faces of family friends. He saw Emily silently crying beside him. He saw Sarah whispering that perhaps they were making a terrible mistake. Then he looked toward his mother, standing in her wedding dress with hope shining in her eyes, and realized there would never be a painless way to do what came next. His voice echoed through the sanctuary. "Mom, don't marry him." The room fell silent. Margaret looked from Ryan to Ethan, unable to understand why the two men she trusted most were standing on opposite sides of the aisle. Ryan handed the envelope to his mother with trembling hands. "Before you say your vows," he whispered, "there's something you deserve to know." Margaret slowly opened the folder. Inside were the newspaper articles, court records, property documents, and a photograph of a man named Nathan Brooks. She raised her eyes toward Ethan, tears already beginning to form. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Please, tell me everything." For the first time since they met, Ethan Walker stepped away from the altar, looked directly into Margaret's eyes, and began with a sentence that left every person in the church holding their breath. "The first promise I ever made to you was that I would never intentionally break your heart. Today, before you decide whether to become my wife, I have to tell you the one truth I should have shared the day we first met." The silence inside St. Michael's Church was unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. Nearly 100 people sat motionless, not because they were waiting for a wedding to continue, but because they were witnessing something far more powerful than a ceremony. Margaret Collins stood only a few feet away from Ethan Walker, the bouquet of white roses now resting forgotten on the front pew beside her. The folder containing newspaper clippings, court documents, and faded photographs remained open in her hands, yet she wasn't looking at the papers anymore. She was looking at the man she loved. For the first time since they met 18 months earlier, Ethan wasn't trying to protect her from the pain of his past. He wasn't choosing his words carefully or leaving difficult chapters untold. He simply stood before her with nothing left to hide. "My real name was Nathan Brooks," he began softly. "I changed it legally many years ago, but I never changed because I wanted to deceive anyone. I changed because every time someone called me Nathan, I became the man who had lost everything instead of the man who was trying to live again." His voice shook as he spoke, but he never looked away from Margaret. Every sentence carried the weight of years spent carrying a story he believed no one would ever fully understand. Ethan told the congregation everything he had told Ryan beside the lake, but this time he didn't leave out the emotions that had shaped every decision he made. He described the unbearable grief that followed the loss of his wife, Rebecca, and their son, Daniel. He admitted there were mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible and nights when silence inside his home became so overwhelming that he would drive for hours simply to avoid returning to it. He explained that changing his name had never been an attempt to erase his family. In fact, he visited their graves every year on the anniversary of the accident, carrying fresh flowers and reading aloud the same handwritten letter he had updated each year for more than 2 decades. "I never stopped loving them," he said, his voice breaking. "I simply reached a point where I believed they would want me to keep living." He turned toward Margaret with tears in his eyes. "Then I met you. You reminded me that happiness isn't something we betray the people we've lost by finding again. It's something we honor them by embracing. I should have told you everything from the beginning. I wanted it so many times. But every day that passed made me more afraid that the truth would make you walk away before you knew my heart." There wasn't a single person inside the church untouched by his honesty. Margaret listened without interrupting, her own tears falling freely now. She thought back to every quiet afternoon they had shared, every conversation about David, every gentle reassurance Ethan had offered whenever guilt made her question whether she deserved to love again. Never once had he asked her to forget her late husband. Never once had he become jealous when she spoke about the life she had shared with David. Instead, he had honored those memories with genuine respect. Suddenly she understood why. Ethan knew exactly what it meant to carry love that never truly leaves. He hadn't hidden his past because he was ashamed of loving another family before her. He had hidden it because reopening those wounds required reliving the darkest years of his life. That realization didn't erase the pain of his silence, but it changed the meaning behind it. Margaret slowly closed the folder and looked toward her children. Ryan's eyes were filled with regret. Emily was openly crying. Sarah could barely stand as emotion overwhelmed her. They hadn't interrupted the wedding because they wanted to deny their mother happiness. They had interrupted it because they believed she deserved complete honesty before making the biggest decision of her future. In that moment, Margaret realized everyone standing before her had acted out of love, even though love had led each of them down different paths. Ryan stepped forward first. His voice trembled as he faced Ethan. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I judged your silence before I understood your pain." Ethan immediately shook his head. "No," he replied. "You did exactly what a son should do. You protected your mother. If Daniel had lived long enough to grow into the kind of man you've become, I would have prayed he loved his family enough to ask difficult questions too." Ryan's composure finally broke. Tears he had held back for weeks came freely as he crossed the aisle and embraced the man he had spent months investigating. Around them, the congregation watched 2 men who had every reason to remain divided instead choose understanding instead. Emily and Sarah soon joined them, apologizing for the hurt their actions had caused while thanking Ethan for finally trusting them with the truth. The tension that had filled the sanctuary only minutes earlier slowly gave way to something far stronger. Compassion, forgiveness, relief. It became clear to everyone present that this had never been a story about a dangerous secret. It had always been a story about grief, fear, and the courage required to tell the truth before it is too late. The pastor, who had quietly observed everything from the altar, stepped forward with a gentle smile. "I've performed weddings for more than 30 years," he said, "and I've learned something important. A strong marriage isn't built on two people who have never made mistakes. It's built on two people willing to bring every hidden corner of their lives into the light." He turned toward Margaret. "The decision is yours, and yours alone. You owe no one an answer except your own heart." The church fell silent once more as every eye returned to Margaret. She walked slowly toward Ethan until they stood face to face. She reached for his hands and held them tightly. "When David died," she whispered, "I thought my heart had finished its work. Then you came into my life and reminded me that love doesn't replace love. It grows beside it. I'm hurt that you waited so long to tell me the truth, but I'm even more grateful that you finally did. I don't want to marry a perfect man, Ethan. I want to marry an honest one. Today, you became that man." A wave of quiet emotion swept through the church as guests wiped away tears and smiled through them. The ceremony began again, but it felt completely different from the one that had been interrupted earlier that morning. This time, there were no hidden questions lingering between the bride and groom. No uncertainty, no fear. Every person in the sanctuary now understood exactly who Ethan Walker had been, who he had become, and why Margaret had chosen to love him despite the painful road that brought him to this moment. Ryan proudly walked his mother the final few steps toward the altar, something he had never imagined doing after bursting through the church doors only an hour earlier. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the applause echoed throughout the sanctuary with a warmth that no one would ever forget. It wasn't simply a celebration of marriage. It was a celebration of truth arriving before it was too late to change everything. Outside the church, autumn leaves drifted gently through the afternoon sunlight as 3 generations gathered together for photographs. Margaret looked at her children, her grandchildren, and the man now standing beside her, realizing that families aren't defined by the absence of hardship. They're defined by the willingness to face hardship together. Months later, Ryan visited Ethan and Margaret for Sunday dinner. As they sat on the porch watching the grandchildren play in the yard, Ryan noticed 2 framed photographs displayed side by side on a nearby table. One showed David Collins smiling beside Margaret many years earlier. The other showed Rebecca and Daniel Brooks, carefully restored from an old photograph Ethan had treasured for decades. Ryan smiled as he looked at them. Margaret noticed and gently squeezed Ethan's hand. "Love doesn't ask us to forget the people who shaped our lives," she said softly. "It asks us to carry them forward while making room for new memories." Ethan nodded, grateful beyond words that the family he thought he had lost forever had somehow found its way back into his life in a different form. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to happiness isn't the truth itself. It's the fear of telling it. And sometimes the people who seem determined to destroy our dreams are actually fighting to protect us because they love us more than we realize. For Margaret Collins, turning 60 wasn't the end of her story. It became the beginning of a new chapter, one built not on perfect people or perfect circumstances, but on forgiveness, honesty, and the extraordinary courage to believe that even after the deepest heartbreak, the heart still has room to love again. If you love this story, subscribe to Channel The Story Chamber and turn up the notification bell on for more upcoming stories.